Welcome back to our series on Plato's Republic. In this episode, we will be finishing up Book 7. And I want to begin by picking up where we left off last time with a discussion of the dark night of the soul as the experience of education, right? So I think what St. John of the Cross was articulating poetically is what the soul goes through in education. And on page 215 of the Reeve translation of the Republic, which is 521 C to D, somewhere around there, you have Socrates saying this: "It seems then that this is not a matter of flipping a potsherd, but of turning a soul from a day that is a kind of night in comparison to the true day, that assent to what is, which we say is true philosophy." Okay, so philosophy is about turning oneself from a night that appears to be a day to the one that's in it, to what's truly the light, or what's the true day. And so all philosophy, I believe, will have something of I don't want to say a theological nature to it, but it has a completion in what theology ultimately aims at, right? So philosophy is education, which is about conversion, turning towards what's true, turning towards what's real. So the philosophical project, the philosophical life, is a life of conversion, and therefore it's essentially opened to the theological or the religious. So I think it's almost a contradiction to talk about an atheistic philosophy, because it seems that there's a essential transcendent or transcending aspect to the philosophical life. Even if you don't know what that towards which you are turning ultimately is, because it's going back to what we described last time. It's the sun and it blinds, and so you sort of remain ignorant of it in and of itself. It's still the case that's consistent with the great theological tradition of Christianity, with the whole apophatic root of mystical theology, where there's a cloud of unknowing surrounding the nature of God. And so the most that we can say about God is that we can't say anything about God as he is, right? So I think this is something which is very profound. It's something that's important to always remember as you study philosophy, as you read philosophy, as you pursue what it really means to philosophize, that it has a fulfillment in something beyond it, beyond itself. Okay, so and I was trying to figure out when to talk about this, but I think this would be a good time to talk about it. So once we have the cave allegory on the table, we can understand what liberal education is, or liberal arts. If you think of it as the freeing arts, the education as liberating, meaning it frees you from what? From, in some ways, yourself, the ways in which you have enslaved yourself, your own biases, your own presumptions about how reality must be known or must be seen. And so education is essentially necessarily liberating. And so it's almost a redundancy to talk about liberal education, because by its very nature, education is liberating, right? And I think the allegory of the cave gives you a beautiful image of that. And one further point of reflection I think is worth bringing up here. The experience of education that you've had and are having, namely those experiences where you come to see that the world, reality, is far more interesting, far more surprising than you ever would have thought, and in such a way that you think you understand, the point of living. You think you understand truth, and then you come to this thing that happens in your life, this event or whatever it is, and it forces you to make a decision, or it forces you into a type of act of the will. Are you going to turn back and continue to live in the world that you are comfortable with, or are you going to let that former world go and proceed in a way that doesn't make sense to you initially, because of the very fact what education is, as we saw, is it's about letting the old world go for the sake of a new world, the old vision for a new vision, and it's not complete skepticism or incoherency, but it is a type of ignorance in a real way, right? And so you can describe education as an experience of death, meaning you undergo a type of death. The world that you live in when you are educated is a world that dies, and it gives rise to a new, fuller, more complete world. And this is articulated more so in theological text. I mean, if you think about St. Paul and the scales falling from his eyes and putting on a new man, and you have all this description of a new world that you live in now that you've made this conversion. You see things as they really are. This is a type of death, right? It's a participation in an experience of what it means to die. And I think this is a very important experience for Plato, because what it does is it gives us, while literally or physically living, it gives us an experience of the meaning of death and ultimately the hope of life in death or through death, right? So just as in education, you have to let something go. Something has to be renounced. Something has to fall out of your grasp. But all your experiences of education have been such that every time you let something go, something more complete, more brilliant, more bright follows. Maybe not initially, but this is the point of education, that you let lower things go for higher things, and the more that you're familiar with that, the more confirmed, or the more I'll just say confirmed you are in the hope of life through all death, because death for Plato seems to be this moving from a lower to a higher. And so I think the significance or the emphasis on education is ultimately what constitutes the grounds for hope in, if you want to call it an afterlife, you can call it an afterlife, but hope in a life through death, just as in education, there's a hope for truth through your ignorance. By being proven ignorant, which is like a type of death, you're closer to the truth. By dying, you're closer to life. I think what he's trying to do, this is more so in the Phaedo, but he's trying to show that education provides the background experience that generates hope in the face of death. So very, very significant to reflect on the meaning of education. It's not merely, as we saw last time, just about putting truth nuggets into your brain. If that's all it was, it would be ultimately a meaningless endeavor. It would just be about like an Easter egg hunt, and it wouldn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so the life of education is a liberating life because it frees you from what enslaves you, which is ultimately your ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of the good. In the allegory of the cave, it's ignorance of the sun, that which gives true sight, true vision to all things. In the context outside of the allegory, namely in what the allegory is of, our very lives, what we're ignorant of is ultimately the purpose, the reason, the logos of existence. What are we seeking when we seek anything? We're seeking fulfillment. We're seeking happiness, which is ultimately the good. Whatever it is, whatever that may be, that's going to ultimately fulfill us beyond anything we could ever possibly even hope for or desire. That is what we're seeking. You could call it the reason of things, the purpose of things, or in Greek, the logos. And it is our ignorance of that which is what enslaves us. And so what we need to do, according to Plato, through education, is we need to orient ourselves to the logos, to the good, so that we don't constitute our own stumbling block in our pursuit of it. Right? There will be things that cause us to have a difficult time understanding the logos or understanding the good or attaining the good. But the thing that we have control over to some extent is whether or not we ourselves prevent a vision or union with the good. And how does this happen? Ultimately, it's through an over-attachment to things that are not the good itself, right? So you have to love things for what they are. So ultimately, the physical world, the world of the physical nature, the world that we occupy, is something which is good, but only through its being an image or a sign of something else. The shadows are good in the cave, they're good, but only as shadows, which is to say they're good only as redirecting us to something more. There is a purpose in having friends. There is a purpose in drinking bourbon, but that fundamental purpose doesn't end in itself. It actually redirects us, or ought to redirect us, to higher goods, better goods. Okay, and so what we need to see reality as what Socrates calls summoners. Now, it's a strange word. I didn't look up what the Greek word was, but my guess is it's something that's like a conjured word, because it's a strange word, but it's very important, beautiful concept. The idea of a summoner is something that is seen or sensed that unsettles us or puzzles us, leaves us desiring something more. Here's an example, I guess you could say. When you look at when you're driving down the highway, this just an example came to me. I'm looking out my window and I see a road that's going long distance. It reminded me of this phenomenon. When you're driving down a highway, say somewhere in the Midwest, and it's a really hot summer July day, you look out and you see kind of a hazy, bent ground in front of you, right? And your initial reaction, the first time you've seen this, it almost looks like there might be like water on the road, right? This classic example of a mirage. And so your initial thought is, why are things like that? Things shouldn't be looking like that, right? And it almost looks like still things are moving, right? You can kind of see things slowly shifting, at least it looks like. And so there's something summoning you, or at least your understanding, your reason. Your sight is sort of calling out, and this is all metaphorical, right? So don't take this in too literal of a sense, but to carry on the metaphor, when your vision is calling out to your understanding and saying, this shouldn't be like this. There's something more than meets the eye here. Think this through. Investigate this more, because something which is still is also moving. So there's this like compresence of opposites. There's this union of opposite things here. Stillness and motion, right? The ground in front of you is still, but it's also has the appearance of moving. As you approach it, you realize it's still. As you back up, you realize it's moving, or at least it looks like it's moving. And so it kind of summons a type of thought that goes beyond mere sensation. So that's what a summoner is. It's as Socrates puts it, I'll just read you the passage, 523c. The ones that do not summon the understanding are all those that do not at the same time result in an opposite sense perception. We'll return to that here in a second. But the ones that do, I call summoners. That is when sense perception does not make one thing any more clear than its opposite, regardless of whether what strikes the senses is close by or far away. What I mean will be clearer if you look at it this way. These, we say, are three fingers, the smallest, the second, and the middle finger. Okay, so then he goes on to this example of the fingers, which we'll talk about here in a second. But a summoner is distinguished from a non-summoner. And what a non-summoner is something that you just look at, you perceive, and you just see it one way. Oh, it just seems it's this way and no other way. It's sort of seeing things as black and white, right? And then what a summoner is you look at something and it kind of inclines you, the sight or the vision or the sense perception inclines you to say both. No, it does look this way and it also looks the opposite. So it looks like it's this like contradictory or there's contraries, occurring at one time. You could think of it this way, you could think of it this way. And it's the perception which kind of toys or troubles your experience, right? So the example of the fingers is also, I think, an interesting example. Kind of difficult to comprehend at first, but hopefully as we talk through this, it'll make a little sense. So instead of three fingers, just consider two fingers, right? So there's a sense in which two fingers are two, but each of the fingers is one. What makes them one is that they're separate from each other. If they weren't separate, then they would just be one finger. So the two are made two because they're separate. the two fingers are also, in a sense, one thing. Namely, that one thing that they are is two fingers. So there's a sense in which the two fingers are both one individually and two jointly, and so there's almost like two ways you can think of it. You could think of them as two. You could think of them as one, and it kind of leads you to think that there's a complexity. There's something more than meets the eye going on here. Vision alone isn't going to solve this problem. Is what's there one, or is what's there two? Vision isn't going to solve that problem because you can kind of see it in both ways. It's both one and it's two. This is the phenomenon that we discussed at the very beginning of the Republic, which I said the Republic ultimately is a dialogue about, and that's the relationship of parts to wholes, or the one to the many. And why I think this is significant at this stage of the Republic is because this phenomenon of the relationship of parts to wholes, or seeing things as many and seeing things as one, as I've already alluded to in the first few podcasts of this series, is a phenomenon which is ubiquitous. It's all over the place, right? The relationship of the one to the many, parts to the wholes, is just all over the place. Is it letters, or is it a word that's on the page, right? Is it a word, or is it a sentence? You kind of want to say it's all of those things. But words and letters are, strictly speaking, different, because you can see letters and not see a word, because you're not a reader. Maybe you're only like 3 years old and you know your letters, but you don't know words. So you can like make this distinction between letters and words, even though they're in some ways one and the same thing. So it's a complicated thing upon investigation. But what Socrates is trying to do, rather than address it and come up with an answer to, oh, here's how the one's related to the many, what he wants to say is, this is like a great gift. This perplexity, this paradox of the parts and the wholes, the one and the many, that we see in reality. It's a grace. It's the origin of education, because it is what sets you off in motion towards a higher understanding. If you weren't puzzled by things, you wouldn't seek a higher vision or a higher understanding, right? So it's puzzlement, it's perplexity, it's knowledge of a type of ignorance that constitutes the life of education, right? And so the more that you can wonder, this is another way of describing this in the philosophical tradition is wonder. Wonder, like you wonder why something's the case. It's sort of a puzzlement or perplexity that you have about something, which seems obvious but also seems complicated. That is the source or the origin of this transcendence out of the cave, right? Without that, there would be no, you would not feel the need or the desire to leave the cave. Stated another way, I'll just read a bunch of passages, because I think this is a really important, as I mentioned, important concept for understanding the Republic, and ultimately its relation to the significance for your life, and the value of education. Unfortunately, the way most people think of education is that it kills this wonder, it kills this perplexity. It's saying, if you have to ask questions about something, you're stupid and you shouldn't be in the classroom. It's actually the exact opposite. The better you are as a student, the more questions you should be asking, the more puzzlement, the more perplexity you should be having about reality. Because the more that you understand, the more firmer, more solid of a foundation you'll have not to like master reality, but to question it, right? It's hard to know how to ask a question. That's the real challenge. The challenge isn't finding the answers. The challenge is in figuring out what are the good questions to ask. Okay. So here's another passage which I think is states this point beautifully. This is 523e. It is likely then that a perception of that sort would not summon or awaken the understanding. And the perception is, when you look at a finger, you just see a finger. It's that it's a finger doesn't kind of perplex you. But he says, but that it's one finger or that it's one thing, better put, that it's one thing, does kind of perplex you, because you see it as one thing, but you also see many things. There's the fingernail, there's the hairs on the knuckles and all that, right? So you see one thing, but it also is the case that you see many things in seeing that one thing. And so you're already set in motion to want to ask some questions. So the notion of seeing something as one is a summoner for Socrates, because of the fact that it puzzles you, because that sensation of oneness conjoins with it manyness, okay, or plurality. On the next page, and without that, you would not be an educated person. Your soul would be dead or asleep, as he puts it. The educated person is someone whose soul is alive, because they experience that and they're like awakened and they want to know more. They want to figure this out. This shouldn't be. How can it be both one and many? And that kind of is a type of life in the soul, right? And so it's the perception of oneness that makes your soul come alive, and therefore it frees you from the ignorance that you may have had. Okay, so a little bit later, 524d, he goes on. That then is what I was trying to express when I said that some things summon thought while others do not. I define summoners, here's an interesting definition of summoners. I define summoners as those that strike the relevant sense at the same time as do their opposites, right? So the relevant sense sort of sees it both ways. I see this both ways. And that almost says sense cannot adjudicate between, is it this way or is it this way, or how should I think about the relation between these two things? Sense sort of proves itself inadequate, and so it automatically awakens something beyond sense, which is reason, to kick in to say, okay, you take over. I can't figure this out. I did my best as vision. I can't see my way through this. The intellect or reason is going to have to take it over and see through how to best understand this. Okay, so that's once again metaphorical way of thinking of the faculty of sight talking to the faculty of reason, but that's just sort of a childish metaphor, although perhaps useful. Okay, so the once reason gets kind of online and awoken because of the summoner of sight, of the oneness in the manyness, or the manyness in the oneness that you see in the world, reason comes on the scene, and it starts to think through it, and so it then, you could think of you're now not merely looking at the world, but you're in a whole new domain, a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of conceiving, right? So you're now trying to think about, well, how is one related to many? I'm not worried about particular things like this tree is one tree, but it's many parts. I do want to know just more generically, there's something fishy going on in the relationship of parts to wholes. Let's just think about this in the abstract, the relationship of parts to wholes. So now you've kind of taken a transcendent view or transcendent project on board, right? And so you're now almost in a life above or beyond the mere physical world of sensation. And so he says that this faculty of or this endeavor, this act of calculation, rational thought, rational calculation, as he puts it on 525 DE, somewhere around there. He says it gives the soul a stronger lead upwards, and it compels it to discuss the numbers and sort of more in the abstract natures, the relation of one to many as such, and so you find yourself thinking about things in a completely different way now, or at least wanting to think about things in a completely different way. Even if you haven't figured it out, the fact that you want to already means that you've made this ascent beyond mere sensation. And so this is comparable to geometry, and so this is a metaphor that may only kind of move, I don't know, 1 out of every 5,000 people, because there's not a whole lot of people out there that get really giddy about geometry. But the idea I think he has in mind is in geometry you can study two-dimensional geometric figures, right? You can just on a plane, right? You have a square and you have lines, and you talk about intersecting this, and the angles are equal to this and that. And so you can go through all of this and think through the relationship of all these geometric figures within the world of two-dimensional geometry. That is just like on a piece of paper. But once you start thinking about geometry three-dimensionally, all of that, it's not like it's out of the window, but all of it gets transfigured and transformed, and you realize that's only one story at a lower level of geometry. There's a whole world of geometry that two dimensions can't even conceive of or fathom. And so when you get to, as he says, 528b, after a plane surface, we went immediately to a solid that was revolving without taking one just by itself, but the right way is to take up the third dimension after the second. Okay, so you spend your life thinking about squares and circles, and then all of a sudden someone says, you're only thinking about just a fraction of all the geometric figures out there. And you're like, what in the world are you talking about? I've got squares and I've got triangles and I've got circles. What else is there? And someone says, cubes. They're cubes. And someone's like, I don't understand what a cube is. Draw it for me on this piece of paper. And you say, well, I really can't, because cubes don't fit on a piece of paper. They're three-dimensional. They're not two-dimensional. And if the person is like, unless you put it on this piece of paper, I'm not going to understand how this is a geometric figure. The answer isn't to try to put a cube on a piece of paper, because that's impossible. But the answer is to try to get them to see that their conception of geometry is too narrow. They've got to come to question or to be perplexed by the limitations of two-dimensional geometry. And so if they do that, then they can say, what? Maybe there's a whole different way of thinking of geometry, which has to go beyond two dimensions. And so then once you do that, it's open to say, maybe there's geometric figures that can't be just put on a piece of paper. Now, some of you might be saying, but you can draw a cube on a piece of paper. Well, you don't really draw a cube. You just draw like an image, a two-dimensional image, which represents a three-dimensional object. Right? There's no way you can draw on a piece of paper a three-dimensional object. It's just a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object. Okay, hopefully that's not too nerdy for you. But the idea is the way that you go from thinking of things in a two-dimensional manner to a three-dimensional manner is a type of transcendence that comes through a type of summoning of this recognition of not being settled or having an unease with the limitations of the two-dimensional. Likewise, the movement, more broadly construed in education, from the physical to the intelligible, ultimately to the good, it's an analogous type of ascent. It's just you have to learn to look at the world in a different way. An example of this, I don't know, this may make sense to some of you, but the example of this is, you hear people say that everything is a creation of God, and therefore everything is good, and everything is an image of God, in virtue of being an effect. Effects always resemble their cause, and so there's something godlike about everything that exists. Now, what would it be to really look at the world and really see that everything is an image of God? Even the things that you don't like, crying babies in the middle of the night, having to change their diapers, having a broken toe, missing your airline flight to go home for Christmas, storms that rain out, the Tim McGraw concert that you were wanting to go to, or whatever it is. What would it be to see all of those events, all of those happenings, as as manifestations of God's goodness, of God Himself? To see those as revelations of the good. It would require a different view on the world, a different vision that many of us just don't have. A lot of us want to have it, but it's having it and wanting to have it are different. If you are actually going to have that vision of the world, it might require that you have to prepare yourself for it, which means you have to learn to let certain things go. And this, I think, is what lies at the root of the notion of abandonment to divine providence, which is an act of humility. It's a way of coming to this recognition that there's an order which my actions are trying to align to, rather than I'm trying to make the order what it is. And so once you can kind of prepare yourself in the right way, then you become capable of seeing the world in the right way. And that's analogous to what Socrates says about in order for you to turn your head, your whole body has to be turned towards this. And he says this at the very end of the allegory of the cave. It's worth going back to look at this. This is, I believe I read it in the last podcast. 5:18, between C and D. It's right around here. Just as an eye cannot be turned around from darkness to light except by turning the whole body, so this instrument must be turned around by what comes to be together with the whole soul, until it is able to bear to look at what is, and at the brightest thing that is, the one we call the good. Okay, so the just as to turn the eye, the whole body needs to be turned. To turn your soul towards the good, the whole of you needs to be ordered and turned towards that. Another way of putting it is you can't serve two masters. There's no way you'll have this vision on the world to see everything as a participation in the good if you serve two masters. That is, if you live a split life, your eyes won't be able to look at reality if your body, metaphorically, or the passions, is wedded to something else. And so I think this is a very practical point. It's basically saying that at the root of ethics is a type of metaphysics that you have to learn to order your whole existence towards this way of seeing, if you're going to actually see that way. And so it's not just one part of you that gets educated, but it's the whole of you. And therefore the whole of you is free rather than just one part of you is free. A real beautiful, way of thinking this through. And so the cave, I think, can ultimately be seen as this transcendence to see the good as it is, which would then allow you in this world, and by this world, I don't mean like God's world is, outside of Mars and this is Earth and it's this world. What I mean is, just as you could talk about the world of letters and the world of words as two different worlds that kind of coexist, I would say something similar about the world of the good and the world of matter. It's not like there's this other spatially separated world. It's more about seeing differently. But once you learn to see the good as such, looking at the physical world is going to enliven it and enrich it and make it seen as good. You can, as you go back into the cave, even though it's going to be dark, it'll be such that you can see it all as imperfect, but orienting towards what is perfect. So it kind of gives it a value in ordering, signifying something more than it. There's this part in, I believe it's Augustine's Confessions, when he talks about it's this sort of contemplative experience that he has where he sees everything, and he sees them as like these little speakers, not like audio speakers, but like, looking at the trees and the birds and the fish and the sunrise and the mountains. It all is screaming out, shouting. This is like a psalm. It's saying, I am not he, but he is who made me. That's what all of creation is saying for St. Augustine. And I think what Plato would say is that's what the physical world is saying about the good. I am not the good, but I order you towards the good. That's how I am good, is that I direct you towards what is higher.